Order. Without objection, the chair is authorized to declare recesses of the subcommittee at any time. Good afternoon and welcome to today's hearing entitled Bolstering Data Privacy and Mobile Security, an assessment of IMSI catcher threats. I recognize myself for 5 minutes for an opening statement. Well, good afternoon again. Welcome to today's Oversight Subcommittee hearing, Bolstering Data Privacy and Mobile Security, an assessment of IMSI catcher threats. The purpose of today's hearing is to examine the threats that IMSI catchers and other similar technologies pose to mobile security and user privacy. IMSI catchers and rogue base stations, commonly known by their brand name Stingray, are devices used for intercepting cellular traffic and data. Today we will hear from government and academic experts about the basics of the technology, the ways in which it can be used by both legitimate and illegitimate actors, and potential methods to mitigate these risks these devices pose. Regrettably, although they were invited, the Department of Homeland Security, DHS, declined to provide a witness today and instead provided a briefing to members and staff last week. While this was helpful in giving some context to the matter, it was no substitute for a public discussion on such a serious issue. It would have been substantially more helpful for DHS to have been present today to be part of the dialogue, inform the American public, and answer questions about their work in this area. With that said, I would like to thank our witnesses for participating today and taking time out of their schedules to testify on this very important matter. Historically, the use of IMSI catcher technology has been limited to law enforcement, Department of Defense, intelligence services. This was due in large part to the high cost of actually acquiring this equipment. However, as sophisticated technologies have become more commonplace and advances in manufacturing have made the production of highly technical products easier and cheaper, IMSI catcher technology and nefarious actors looking to exploit it have been proliferated. While awareness is important, it is simply not enough to acknowledge an issue that needs to be addressed. Instead, we must also gain an understanding of the technology, the nature of the technology, the complexity of the technology, and the disruptive ability like IMSI catchers challenge and the challenges they present. This is a responsibility the committee takes seriously and one which the committee has a long history of meeting through vigorous oversight of emerging forms of research and technology. I believe today's hearing will yet add another important chapter to that history. As with much of technology in the modern age, IMSI catchers are a double-edged sword. On one hand, when used for legitimate law enforcement purposes, these technologies have potential to positively impact society in a substantive and meaningful way. The ability to covertly track a suspect or intercept their data has the potential to help law enforcement coordinate safer arrests and certainly put more criminals behind bars, keeping our men and women in uniform as well as our communities safe. However, as we have seen with many new technologies and law enforcement tools, striking the appropriate balance between safety and privacy is not always easy. Just this past week, the Supreme Court ruled in Carpenter v. United States that cell phone location records are protected under the Fourth Amendment, previously a legally gray area. While this ruling does not purport to apply to real-time data tracking, the type the IMSI catcher technology could provide, it raises the question of what the appropriate balance is between protecting privacy and empowering law enforcement to do their job. Similarly, we must consider what defenses we can and should employ to protect our privacy and national security. IMSI catcher technology is ripe for exploitation by foreign nations seeking to spy on American government officials and is likely already being used to do so. The cryptographic standards and methods used to protect U.S. government officials and important government information are something the National Institute of Standards and Technology is well positioned to produce, but this too creates a dilemma. As we saw with the San Bernardino terrorist iPhone, sophisticated encryption meant to protect user data and privacy brings with it a set of different but no less consequential issues. In the case of IMSI catcher technologies, to what degree should the general public be able to shield themselves from being caught in a foreign intelligence operation? To what degree might techniques meant to shield data from prying eyes prevent law enforcement from doing their job? How much privacy should we trade for security at the civilian and governmental levels? These are the fundamental questions that must be asked. While I doubt we will hear any easy answer to these questions during today's hearings, we will hear informed perspectives from our witnesses on these and other important questions. It is my hope that we will leave here not only with a better understanding of this technology, but with forward-looking thoughts about possible answers to and solutions for these tough questions. Again, I want to thank our witnesses for agreeing to be here to highlight this important topic. At this time, I'd ask unanimous consent that we include in the record the letter, I've got it here, that was sent to the subcommittee this morning by the Electronic Privacy Information Center, or EPIC. Although I'm not sure I agree with the entirety of their statement, we will include this in the record, this letter in the record. I now recognize Ranking Member of the full committee, Ms. Johnson, for an opening statement.
Thank you very much, Chairman Abraham. Cell site simulators, also known as stingrays or IMSI catchers, is a technology that can be used to locate cellular devices and possibly intercept voice calls, text messages, and data communication from the cellular device. It is a valuable tool for our law enforcement and intelligence communities. It is also undoubtedly a technology used by foreign intelligence services operating here in the United States. Indeed, the genesis of today's hearing were recent press reports that a Department of Homeland Security pilot program found rogue cell sites throughout Washington, D.C., including near the White House, FBI headquarters, and the Pentagon. It is clear that foreign intelligence agencies are seeking to use cell site simulators to collect intelligence on federal officials. What are we as a government doing to counter this particular threat? Unfortunately, neither Department of Homeland Security nor the Federal Bureau of Investigation is here today to help provide some answers to these questions. It is also unfortunate that President Trump appears to be taking no safeguards to protect himself from these cyber threats, and the Science Committee has taken no steps to use our oversight authority to investigate the White House's lack of cybersecurity precautions that we expect all other federal agencies to follow. I reiterate that Mr. Byers' call in his statement and request that we hold a hearing on this subject in the near future. I am glad, though, to have our witness panel here today who can provide us with advice on what Congress should be doing to protect federal officials and federal agencies from cell site simulators that exploit our cybersecurity vulnerabilities, particularly those that impact our national security interests. Cell site simulator technology also has implications for the privacy of Americans. As a law enforcement operation utilizing a cell site simulator could be gathering data from thousands of nearby innocent citizens. In Baltimore, for instance, police use this technology without obtaining a warrant, thousands of times in violation of the Fourth Amendment of the U.S. Constitution regarding an unreasonable search. Last week, the U.S. Supreme Court weighed in on this issue, requiring police to obtain a warrant to gather cell phone location data. However, their decision did not specifically apply to cell site simulators, so it is unclear how these key privacy issues will be addressed by law enforcement agencies in the future. I'm glad Dr. Jonathan Mayer from Princeton University, a lawyer and a computer scientist, is here today. He is uniquely qualified to speak on these important privacy issues, as well as the wider implications of this technology and the dangers it poses to our national security and our privacy. I look forward to hearing from him and other witnesses about how we can protect our national security and the privacy of our citizenry from attack by these rogue cell sites and other cyber threats that can target our mobile devices. Thank you, Chairman Abraham, and thanks to all the witnesses for being here.
Thank you, Ms. Johnson. I now recognize the ranking member of the Oversight Subcommittee, the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Byer, for an opening statement.
Thank you, Chairman Abraham, very much, and thank you for your initiative to create this hearing. Cell site simulators or IMSI catchers pose risks to both our national security and our personal privacy. These devices are about the size of a laptop computer and can be placed in a van, hotel room, drone aircraft, or operated by someone sitting on a park bench. These rogue cell stations masquerade as legitimate cell towers and gather the data of cell phones in their proximity. They're powerful tools employed by both friendly and hostile intelligence agencies, criminals, and others. But they also play an important role in the operations of U.S. law enforcement and the U.S. intelligence community. However, U.S. law enforcement agencies have not always obtained appropriate authorization from the courts before they've employed these tools against suspected criminals, and this has led to improper incursions into the private lives of hundreds of American citizens. Last week, the Supreme Court ruled that the government must now obtain a warrant when collecting cell phone data in certain cases. The court found, and I quote, "A cell phone faithfully follows its owner beyond public thoroughfares and into private residences, doctors' offices, political headquarters, and other potentially revealing locales. Accordingly, when the government tracks the location of a cell phone, it achieves near-perfect surveillance, as if it had attached an ankle monitor to the phone's user," unquote. However, the court added that it was a narrow ruling, specifically stating, quote, "We do not express a view on matters not before us, real-time CSLI, cell site location information, or tower dumps." Unfortunately, it seems the constitutionality of cell site simulator use by law enforcement agencies without a warrant remains unsettled. Rogue cell site simulators have not only affected our privacy, but they have endangered our national security. Last year, a Department of Homeland Security pilot project identified several rogue cell site simulators near the White House and Pentagon, raising the specter of foreign intelligence agencies using IMSI catchers to target senior U.S. government officials right here in our nation's capital. Ironically, at the same time, we're holding an oversight hearing on the threat to mobile security of these sorts of rogue cell sites. President Trump continues to ignore basic cybersecurity practices. This has created a threat not only to his personal privacy, but also to our national security. A headline from a CNN story in April read, "Trump ramps up personal cell phone use." In May, Politico summed up the president's attitude towards the cybersecurity issues we're discussing today. The headline read, "Too inconvenient. Trump goes rogue on phone security." And making matters worse, President Trump recently said that he provided his direct phone number to North Korean dictator Kim Jong-un. Doing this has opened up an additional threat known as Signaling System 7, or SS7 attack, that may permit access to President Trump's personal cell phone remotely by North Korean intelligence operatives. Earlier this month, Wired magazine published a story with the headline, "Trump says he gave Kim Jong-un his direct number. Never do that." And I'm attaching all three articles to my statement. Ongoing use of a reportedly unsecure cell phone by the President of the United States raises a serious cybersecurity issues that this committee should be examining. The Majority Oversight Plan said the Science Committee would investigate cybersecurity incidents in compliance with, quote, "federal information security standards and guidelines, regardless of where they may be found." Let me repeat, quote, "regardless of where they may be found." I wrote to Chairman Smith with Ranking Member Johnson and Mr. Lipinski in February of this year, pointing out numerous cybersecurity practices of serious concern at the White House that warranted investigation. Unfortunately, we have not yet seen efforts by this committee to uphold its oversight responsibilities to the American public and investigate these issues. My good friend Chairman Abraham, I'm asking you again, let's look at holding this hearing and investigating the potential threat by rogue cell site simulators. But while we do this, we can't ignore the specific threats within blocks of the White House and President Trump's own failure to abide by cybersecurity best practices. You know, in January 2018, White House Chief of Staff Kelly banned the use of personal cell phones in the West Wing by White House employees, yet multiple media stories have continued to report that the president refuses to give up his personal cell phone or take proper cybersecurity measures to help identify and diminish cybersecurity threats. The president should not be held to a different standard than the rest of the federal government, and our committee should help the executive branch protect Mr. Trump from foreign adversaries, even if the president won't. So I look forward to hearing from all of our witnesses today who help us explore ways to enhance our cybersecurity. It's unfortunate we don't have anyone from DHS or the telecommunications, but I hope we'll be able to hear from them in the future. Successfully addressing these issues is going to take a collective effort and a continued commitment from a wide range of stakeholders. Thank you, Chairman Abraham, and I yield back.
And now I'll introduce our witnesses. Our first witness is Dr. Charles H. Romine, Director of the Information Technology Laboratory at Nist. Dr. Romine joined Nist in 2009 as an Associate Director for the Program Implementation. In November 2011, Dr. Romine became the Director of Information Technology Laboratory at Nist. Dr. Romine received both his Bachelor of Arts degree in Mathematics and his PhD in Applied Mathematics from the University of Virginia. Welcome. Dr. T. Charles Clancy, our next witness, he's the Director of Virginia Tech's Hume Center for National Security and Technology. Dr. Clancy has worked with Virginia Tech since 2010 as a professor. Prior to that, he worked at the National Security Agency from 2000 to 2010. He holds a bachelor's degree in computer engineering from Rose-Hulman Institute of Technology and a master's degree in electrical engineering from the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. Dr. Clancy also received a doctorate from the University of Maryland, College Park in computer science. Dr. Jonathan Meyer, our last witness, assistant professor at Princeton University's Department of Computer Science and the Woodrow Wilson School of Public and International Affairs. Dr. Meyer previously worked for Senator Kamala Harris as a technology advisor in 2017. Prior to that, he worked for the Federal Communications Commission Enforcement Bureau as the chief technologist from 2015 to 2017. He holds a bachelor's degree in public and international affairs from Princeton University. Dr. Meyer also received his Juris Doctorate and PhD from Stanford University. I now recognize Dr. Romine for 5 minutes to present his testimony.
Chairman Abraham, Ranking Member Beyer, Ranking Member Johnson, and members of the subcommittee, I'm Charles Romine, Director of the Information Technology Laboratory at the National Institute of Standards and Technology, known as NIST. Thank you for the opportunity to appear before you today to discuss our role in mobile device security. In the cybersecurity realm, NIST has worked with federal agencies, industry, and academia since 1972, and NIST's role has been expanded to research, develop, and deploy information security standards and technology to protect the federal government's information systems against threats, as well as to facilitate and support the development of voluntary, industry-led cybersecurity standards and best practices for critical infrastructure. Today, I'd like to talk about our work related to rogue base stations and the NIST Special Publication 800-187, Guide to LTE Security, released in December 2017. Rogue base stations are unlicensed cellular devices that are not owned or operated by a duly licensed mobile network operator. They're known by many names, such as cell site simulators, stingrays, or International Mobile Subscriber Identity, or IMSI, catchers. Rogue base stations act as a cell tower and broadcast a signal pretending to be a legitimate mobile network that may trick an individual's device into connecting to it. The necessary hardware to build a rogue base station is inexpensive, easily obtained, and the software required is freely available. Rogue base stations exploit the fact that mobile devices will connect to whichever base station is broadcasting as a device's preferred carrier network and is transmitting at the highest power level. Therefore, when a rogue base station is physically near a mobile device that is transmitting at higher power levels than the legitimate antenna, the device may attempt to connect to that malicious network. The threats from rogue base stations can come from their performing a passive attack known as IMSI catching. This attack collects mobile device identities without the user's knowledge. It poses a significant threat to user privacy and security and safety because a malicious actor can determine if a subscriber is in a given location at a given time. Unfortunately, IMSI catching is no longer an advanced or complex attack, only accessible to a small number of individuals. A more advanced attack that can be executed using a rogue base station is a type of man-in-the-middle attack in which a malicious actor can force a user to downgrade to an older and less secure mobile network technology, such as 2G or 3G, that exposes that user to less robust security protections that exist in older versions of mobile networks, tricking the device into connecting to the rogue base station. A complex denial of service attack can occur when a mobile device first connects to a network, when certain messages can be sent to a device by a rogue base station, essentially fooling the device to go into the equivalent of airplane mode. This can cause a denial of service that may persist until a hard reboot is done. Since 2012, Nist has been working in cybersecurity aspects of telecommunications, focusing on 4G LTE networks used by public safety. This work enabled Nist to develop the Guide to LTE Security, which serves as a guide to the fundamentals of how LTE networks operate. It explores the LTE security architecture, and it provides an analysis of the threats posed to LTE networks and supporting mitigations. The guide is intended to educate federal agencies and other organizations that rely on 4G LTE networks as part of their operational environment. Nist has been an active participant in the working group of the standards development organization responsible for security and privacy of 3G and 4G LTE, and recently 5G. Active participation with the mobile network ecosystem developing security standards for future networks is an important way Nist works to address security vulnerabilities in mobile networks today. Security standards for 5G are, in fact, seeking to address issues surrounding rogue base stations through the introduction of optional privacy functionality. Once this functionality standard is developed for future networks, its implementation by mobile network operators will have the potential to eliminate the threat of today's passive sniffing IMSI catchers. In addition, the use of the optional security settings and next-generation 5G technologies will go a long way to mitigate the usage of rogue base station technology. Much work still needs to be done to ensure secure deployments. Nist will continue its research and development in the security of telecommunications, the publication of guidelines and best practices, and our work with international standards bodies and technical committees. Thank you for the opportunity to testify on Nist's work regarding telecommunications security, and I'll be pleased to answer any questions you may have.
Well, thank you, Romine, Dr. Romine. All right, I now recognize Dr. Clancy for 5 minutes to present his testimony.
Chairman Abraham, ranking members Beyer and Johnson, subcommittee members. My name is Charles Clancy, and I'm a professor of electrical and computer engineering at Virginia Tech, where I direct the Hume Center for National Security and Technology. My current research sits at the intersection of 5G wireless, the Internet of Things, cybersecurity, and artificial intelligence. Prior to joining Virginia Tech, I led a portfolio of wireless research and development programs at the National Security Agency. It is my distinct pleasure to address this committee on topics of critical national importance. Security of wireless infrastructure is critical. These devices, wireless base stations, and core network infrastructure are a key part of our critical infrastructure ecosystem. While each generation of cellular technology improves security and privacy, the backward compatibility challenge means that even if we deploy highly secure 5G networks, most phones can still connect to insecure 2G networks, even though many of the national carriers in the United States have already decommissioned their 2G infrastructure. This mixture of old and new technologies means that insecurity will always be part of the cellular ecosystem. Combating threats to wireless network infrastructure requires a risk management approach that constantly evaluates potential vulnerabilities, observes threats, engineers countermeasures, and communicates best practices. Specifically with respect to IMSI catchers, as we've heard, IMSI catchers, also known as stingrays, have come to symbolize a wide range of different cellular surveillance technologies. Rogue base stations, a particular class of surveillance technology, also known as a cell site simulator, are devices that act like cell towers. 2G technology is particularly susceptible to these threats because authentication in 2G is weak and the encryption has been cracked. 2G rogue base stations are able to lure a phone into connecting, eliciting that phone's identity, also known as an IMSI, prevent it from disconnecting, query the phone's precise GPS location, and in certain cases intercept voice, data, and SMS content. 3G and 4G rogue base stations are less capable because the underlying standards are more secure. However, they are still able to elicit a phone's identity. Earlier this year, 5G adopted a proposal known as IMSI encryption, which prevents 5G rogue base stations from successfully eliciting a phone's identity, which was seen, I think, generally as a very positive step forward. Rogue base stations can be used for a variety of applications, but are most commonly associated with IMSI catching. They interact with a phone for a few milliseconds to learn the phone's identity, and then pass that phone back to the real network. Another class of device is a more generic cell phone interception system. These devices are purely passive. They don't transmit anything. They don't pretend to be a cell tower. However, particularly for 2G standards, which have been cracked, they're able to intercept in bulk voice, SMS, and data traffic that is traversing those networks. For 3G and 4G networks that are protected by stronger encryption, there are much fewer capabilities that are possible. However, these technologies can be used together, for example, in conjunction with a jammer. Imagine jamming the 3G and 4G signal spectrum, which causes a phone to downgrade to 2G and then is vulnerable to the widest range of potential attacks. So these downgrade attacks undermine the improved security features that we see in the newer cellular standards. So with respect to closing the gap, 2G, in my opinion, represents one of the weakest links. The weak encryption and authentication is a major security challenge with modern cell phones. And interestingly, carriers have already decommissioned much of the 2G infrastructure here in the United States. So if carriers were able to push policies to phones that would prevent phones from connecting to vulnerable 2G networks, this would go a long way into addressing this issue. Currently, iPhones lack the ability to do this, and with Android phones, you have to know a secret number to type in that results in a secret diagnostic menu that allows you to change this setting. Not exactly user-friendly, and I think with improved user interfaces and making this the default, we would make users much more secure. As we think about a downgrade, sort of the decommissioning of 2G, we have to be careful, though. Many rural networks still rely on 2G, and there are many devices, from vehicle telematics to home alarm systems, that rely on 2G networks to provide connectivity. Lastly would be is if we do want to try and identify, detect, and track rogue base stations, it's important to understand the motivation for doing so. There certainly are telltale signs that a base station is a rogue base station, and phones are able to differentiate that with a variety of hardware and software modifications. Also, there are standards within the cell phone networks that will allow cell phone carriers to be able to track rogue base station activity. In fact, the new 5G security standards makes a specific recommendation about how this data can be used. However, when we consider this, we must consider to what end we seek to track down these base stations: to notify the user, to notify the carrier, and if so, how that data should be used. So looking forward, I recommend the subcommittee consider the following. First, as 2G network infrastructure is decommissioned, phones should not prefer 2G in any circumstances. Next, individuals who are likely targets of foreign intelligence should use phones that meet the needed security countermeasures. And finally, if you do seek to track down IMSI catchers, first address to what end and how that data will be used. Thank you for the opportunity to address the subcommittee today, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Dr. Clancy. Dr. Meyer, 5 minutes.
Chairman Abraham, Ranking Member Beyer, Ranking Member Johnson, members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to address cell site simulators and the broader topic of communication security and privacy at today's hearing. These issues were central to my recent service as Chief Technologist of the Federal Communications Commission Enforcement Bureau. They've been an essential component of my computer science and legal research. In last week's groundbreaking Carpenter against United States decision, the Supreme Court recognized that, quote, cell phones and the services they provide are such a pervasive and insistent part of daily life that carrying one is indispensable to participation in modern society, end quote. The private sector, the public sector, and the American people all depend on our communications infrastructure. The security and privacy safeguards for that infrastructure have not kept pace with its growing importance to the nation.
Push your button.
Oh, sorry. With its growing importance to the nation. Our communications networks have significant cybersecurity vulnerabilities that could be exploited by criminals and foreign adversaries. And when law enforcement agencies seek to conduct investigations using wireless technology, the applicable federal law is imprecise, outdated, likely unconstitutional, and leaves police departments in legal limbo. In this brief opening statement, I will focus on the security and privacy risks associated with cell site simulators. My written testimony highlights several other areas of cybersecurity vulnerability, including insecure call and text message routing, delayed mobile device software updates, and unauthenticated caller ID, the last of which is responsible for the nationwide explosion of fraudulent robocalls. Cell site simulators, commonly dubbed IMSI catchers, stingrays, or dirt boxes, are devices that exploit omissions and mistakes in the trust between mobile devices and cellular towers. A cell site simulator mimics a legitimate cellular tower and tricks nearby mobile devices into connecting to it. The cell site simulator then takes advantage of the connection to extract information from those devices. The most serious cell site simulator risks are associated with second-generation or 2G wireless protocols, which were initially deployed in the 1990s and remain operational today to support legacy devices and offer service in rural areas. The 2G wireless protocols do not include authentication for cellular towers. As a result, 2G cell site simulators can fully mimic a cellular tower, and these cell site simulators can identify and track nearby mobile devices, can intercept or block voice, text, and data communications involving those devices. While more recent 3G and 4G wireless protocols include authentication for cellular towers, they still have significant cell site simulator vulnerabilities. And while the latest 5G protocols do include a new protection against cell site simulators, that protection is only optional and only effective against some of the known attacks against 3G and 4G networks. The possible criminal uses of cell site simulators are limited only by our collective imagination. Criminals could capture private financial information, for example, and steal funds. They could collect sensitive medical information and conduct blackmail, or they could obtain confidential business information for commercial gain. Cell site simulators also pose a serious national security threat. The federal government is the nation's largest consumer of commercial wireless services, and it is susceptible to the same cybersecurity risks in our communications infrastructure. A foreign intelligence service could easily use cell site simulators to collect highly confidential information about government operations, deliberations, and personnel movements. In responding to the threat of cell site simulators, as well as the other serious cybersecurity risks associated with insecure call and text message routing, delayed mobile device software updates, and unauthenticated caller ID, I encourage the members of this subcommittee to consider leveraging the federal government's communications acquisitions. According to OMB, the United States government spends about $1 billion every year on wireless service and mobile devices. And yet, as DHS acknowledged in a recent report, the federal government has little assurance that it is paying for wireless service and mobile devices that incorporate cybersecurity best practices. Congress should condition its substantial communications outlays on implementation of appropriate cybersecurity safeguards. Before I close, I would like to briefly address law enforcement use of cell site simulators. Federal, state, and local law enforcement agencies use cell site simulators in the course of criminal investigations, either to track the location of a suspect's mobile device or to identify all the mobile devices nearby. At present, the federal government owns over 400 cell site simulators, and at least 73 state and local law enforcement agencies also own cell site simulators. Under current law, it is a violation of Section 301 of the Communications Act for a state or local law enforcement agency to operate a cell site simulator because they're transmitting on licensed wireless spectrum without authorization. Police departments may also run afoul of Section 333, which prohibits wireless jamming because law enforcement cell site simulators could disrupt 911 calls and other wireless connectivity. I believe that cell site simulators are legitimate investigative tools and that they should be available to law enforcement agencies when subject to appropriate procedural safeguards. But until Congress takes action, the nation's police departments will remain in legal limbo. I encourage the members of the subcommittee to consider legislation that both resolves the Communications Act issues with cell site simulators and codifies a warrant requirement for cell site simulator operation. Thank you again for the opportunity to address communication security and privacy at today's hearing, and I look forward to questions from the subcommittee.
Thank you, Dr. Meyer. I thank all the witnesses for that very compelling testimony. I'm going to recognize myself for 5 minutes for the opening round of questions. Dr. Clancy, I'll direct my first one at you. You've previously detailed that you see two possible scenarios moving forward with this overall issue. One is the status quo, with the possibility of increased training and acknowledgement of these targeted attacks. The second is a substantive dive into address the issue, which includes a comprehensive assessment of how we treat cell phone towers, permissioned access, and policy changes through updates to phones. Can you provide a little more detail about the difference in the two options, and which would you prefer?
So I think there are a number of solutions that are possible within this space. There are technical solutions, there are policy solutions, there are legal solutions. I think that there are, the key thing though is to ensure that any action that's taken to I guess, close the gaps that IMSI catchers leverage, takes into consideration a path forward for law enforcement around being able to conduct their operations. So I could imagine scenarios where we essentially look to prevent phones from connecting to IMSI catchers, scenarios where we shut down 2G preference for phones in order to prevent them from being as susceptible to IMSI catchers. But I think any action that we take should be complemented with efforts to ensure that law enforcement still are able to get timely access to location information in order to support their investigations.
Who should lead the effort to have a comprehensive solution to these issues? What set of agencies or people?
Indeed. So certainly anytime we talk about telecommunications and cellular, it's tricky because there are so many stakeholders. DHS is the sector-specific agency associated with telecommunications, so they would seem like a logical choice to take the lead, but certainly the FBI, the FCC, and others are key stakeholders in this process.
Okay, thank you. Dr. Meyer, how does the recent Supreme Court decision on Carpenter versus the United States addressing citizens' Fourth Amendment rights change the acceptable use of this technology?
Thank you for the question. Carpenter, by its own terms, does not regulate real-time location tracking by law enforcement. The majority was clear on that point. It does, however, express a growing concern by the Supreme Court with the scope of law enforcement capability using modern technology, and to the extent it affects courts' views on cell site simulators, it will only serve to heighten the level of protection. That said, I want to be very clear to note, to my knowledge, every recent court decision that has addressed the question of whether cell site simulators are regulated by the Fourth Amendment has concluded that they are regulated by the Fourth Amendment and a warrant is required for their operation.
Do you think it'll have an impact on from this Carpenter decision on lawful and legitimate use of the rogue base stations or the IMSI catchers to thwart criminal activity?
So at the federal level, I don't believe there will be an effect because by policy, the Department of Justice and the Department of Homeland Security already obtain warrants to operate these devices. At the state and local level, my understanding is that some police departments do currently operate these devices without obtaining a search warrant, and they may continue to do those things notwithstanding the Carpenter decision. This issue has not been fully litigated in every jurisdiction.
Okay. Dr. Romine, Nist has published the Mobile Threat Catalog, which provides incredibly useful information about the overall issue of mobile device security. How is Nist getting this information out and in front of vendors and people that need to see it?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We have a collection of stakeholders that are in contact with us on a regular basis. We have thousands of people who subscribe to our newsletters. In general, those are stakeholders that are monitoring the work that we do. We're working through the standards development organizations, the 3GPP, for example, which has a lot of the work that we're doing involves trying to help improve the security of telecommunications activities, and there are channels associated with getting the information out through those mechanisms as well. We also manage an active website with many tens of thousands of hits on a regular basis for people who are looking at what we're doing in cybersecurity broadly and for specific topic areas as well.
Is NIST working with other government agencies to promote this, such as the cybersecurity framework?
Well, it's not directly related to the cybersecurity framework, but we are working with other federal agencies. We encourage a large number of agencies to work for example, in the standards development space, so that all of the requirements and associated concerns can be expressed in those bodies.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Byer.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And it's nice to have a chairman from Texas that loads the panel up with Virginians. So, Dr. Romine, your PhD from UVA is very much appreciated. Dr. Clancy teaching with the Hokies of Virginia Tech. Dr. Mayer, I'm sorry about the Stanford Princeton background, but you can, they can slum it today. So
I enjoy visiting the state.
yeah, it's great. Dr. Mayer, According to press reports, the president frequently uses his unsecured cell phone and routinely refuses to change that as official secure phone. That was one of the recommendations, that people in very sensitive roles have these highly secure phones. We talked about the cell phone number to Kim Jong-un. Can you describe why these practices may put the president's phone at risk from being hacked or penetrated by foreign intelligence agencies?
Any senior official in any of the branches of government, and for that matter, any senior executive in the private sector, should take heightened precautions with respect to their telecommunications equipment. There are possible attacks involving interception of voice and text messages. In my written testimony, I describe how those might proceed. There are also the cell site simulator risks that we've discussed. And in addition, there's an issue of security updates not necessarily getting delivered in a timely fashion to consumer devices, such that they could be remotely compromised. So there are a number of cybersecurity risks that are very significant in this ecosystem that could result in essentially total compromise of communications. And again, anyone in a sensitive position should take heightened precautions.
Great, great. Thank you very much. Dr. Romine, in Dr. Mayer's presentation, he talks about femtocells, consumer hardware sold by wireless providers that extend coverage indoors and into rural areas. Are these the things I bought from Google that allow my wife to use her wireless thing upstairs?
I think that's probably a good example of exactly what was described.
So one of the things that we consumers may have been totally unaware of is by buying essentially the wireless extenders within our home, that we have set up these rogue IMSI devices.
I'd have to double check the particulars, but I don't think that's quite the same, the kind of thing that we're talking about. In the case of these devices, these are lawfully provisioned to provide extended coverage and are not considered camping illegally on spectrum that hasn't been authorized.
I wasn't so worried about us breaking the law as us that we were setting up bad guys to get our
Oh, I see what you're saying. I think, I don't know the particulars of the femtocells and whether they have similar kinds of cybersecurity built into them. I think it would depend on the manufacturer and on the way that they're provisioned, but I would not, well, I better not speculate. I'll have to get back to you on whether I think there's additional vulnerability associated with having femtocells in your home.
Great, great. Dr. Clancy, I loved your recommendations at the end, but you talked about the default setting, that the major phone carriers needed to set default stuff within the Androids, within the iPhones, that would basically disable the 2G thing unless they're specifically roaming. How do we make that happen? Is there a role for Congress there?
That's a good question. It's a fairly simple change to the software of the devices. It could even be done as a policy push from the carrier networks. Right now, users have the ability to shut off 3G and 4G, particularly on iPhones, but they do not have the ability to shut off 2G, which is sort of backwards in my opinion. So, with some minor policy pushes from the carriers that have already decommissioned 2G, these devices would default to only using 3G and 4G.
Is this something that they could tell all of us with our iPhones and Androids to do, or do you have to do that in the units they sell going forward?
Well, it would need to be an update that they push from the networks to the phones. It wouldn't necessarily just be new devices. There is not a way for a user to do it by themselves within the current infrastructure. Even the secret code I talked about that brings up the diagnostic menu where you can change it yourself, it doesn't. Once you reboot your phone, the setting goes away. So you have to sort of constantly go in and make sure that 2G is disabled. So there's some very simple things that can be done with the user interface through software updates that would cause phones to not connect to 2G unless roaming.
Okay, great. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. McNerney.
Well, I thank the chair, and I thank the witnesses. I apologize for leaving during your testimony, but you did have a written testimony that we reviewed beforehand. And my question is similar to Mr. Byer's question, the ranking member's question. Dr. Meyer, in your testimony, you state that the most serious cell site simulator risks are associated with 2G wireless network protocols, which were deployed in the 1990s and remain operational today to support the legacy devices that are out there. Who are the consumers that are most likely to possess these legacy devices?
Well, as Dr. Clancy testified, there are a number of devices like home alarm systems, connected devices that were deployed in the 1990s or early 2000s that just don't have newer cellular technology built into them. Nowadays, we call these things the Internet of Things, but back then it was just your alarm system. So those are the types of devices that might be affected, and it's also important to note that rural connectivity is sometimes provided by 2G because those networks were built out and have not been updated since. That said, I think providing the security protection associated with disabling 2G need not come at the expense of disabling those legacy devices or rural connectivity. For folks who live in an area that doesn't have 2G cover or that has 3G, 4G, or now 5G coverage, disabling 2G wouldn't be a problem.
But there are a lot of legacy devices out there that they're going to continue to require 2G protocols, right?
I'm afraid I don't have a handle on the scale of the use of 2G networks at this point. But it is not an area where we have to make a trade-off between supporting those devices and securing the latest devices. We can do both.
Well, you note that while most 3G and 4G protocols include authentication for cell towers, they still have significant cell tower vulnerabilities. Could you expand on that a little bit?
Sure. In my written testimony, I described three classes of vulnerability in addition to taking advantage of 2G networks. One class of vulnerability is location tracking. There are certain components of the 3G and 4G cellular protocols that enable location tracking even though the base station isn't properly authenticated. So that's one class of attack. Another class of attack is taking advantage of femtocells, as Ranking Member Beyer noted. These are home devices that serve as range extenders. Criminals could compromise these devices and convert them into their own cell site simulators. And in fact, researchers have demonstrated that this can actually be a pretty easy thing to do. The third class of attack I describe takes advantage of either collaborating with or compromising a foreign cellular network and then effectively tricking devices within the United States into roaming on that foreign network. So there are multiple other categories of attack in addition to the 2G issue.
So these range extenders, when they're attacked, does that give the attacker just access to the person that has the range extender, or does it go beyond that?
Those devices could give access to any person targeted by whoever's operating the range extender that's been compromised. And that could allow intercepting voice, intercepting text messages, and intercepting data.
Thank you. Dr. Clancy, when a carrier detects that a rogue base station is in operation, is it currently required to report that to an agency like the FBI?
Currently, the carriers perhaps are collecting enough data to make that determination, but they are not archiving it in a way that it could be analyzed to produce that conclusion. So there's sort of data that exists ephemerally within the carrier networks that could be a telltale sign that an IMSI catcher is operating in their geographic footprint. Right now, that data is not being stored, it's not being analyzed, and it's only now in the 5G standards that it's even proposed that that is a thing that should be done. So I think that is sort of unexplored at this moment in terms of what should be done with that data.
Well, is that a business opportunity or a regulatory opportunity to control that?
So there are other countries where that data is handed over to third parties and used for all manner of analytics. I think those countries have substantially different privacy laws than we do here in the United States. So I think it's data, certainly, given all the focus on cellular privacy we've seen over the last few weeks, that I wouldn't necessarily consider a business opportunity. It would need to be treated carefully. In terms of regulatory, yeah, I mean, I assume you could regulate that that data needed to be analyzed, and if detection was, if you discovered a rogue base station, then you should tell someone. I guess the question is who. Do you file an interference complaint with the FCC? Do you file something with the FBI saying that you've detected an IMSI catcher? These things, of course, could be being used by lawfully by federal law enforcement, or they could be being used unlawfully. And that the carrier wouldn't know which it was.
All right, Mr. Chairman, I'll yield back.
All right, well, so I'm thinking of ditching my cell phone and going to get 2 cans and a string to You got some questions, Mr.? Yeah, we're gonna have a second round of questions now, so we're good. Okay. Yeah, this is such an interesting topic. We're gonna continue here for at least another round. Dr. Meyer, is it possible to attribute an illegal cell site simulator to a particular actor, specifically particular cell site simulators? Do they have characteristics associated with where they were made or the entity using them? For example, if the device was made in China or in Russia, would it have any specific identifiers?
That's a great question, Chairman Abraham. I'm not aware of any instance in which a law enforcement or regulatory agency has successfully tracked down one of these devices. And so I'm not aware of anyone who's tried to attribute one of these devices once they get their hands on it, or having studied the signals emanating from it and concluding that it was definitively a cell site simulator. And so I think in principle it could be possible to attribute one of these devices. Again, I'm not aware of an instance in which folks have gotten close enough to do that.
Dr. Clancy, you have anything to add to that?
So in my experience, there's broadly two classes of these devices. There are the expensive ones that are manufactured principally for military and law enforcement use, and their signaling parameters would likely have one set of characteristics associated with it. There's another that's based on inexpensive open source hardware and software that you would likely find being used potentially by foreign intelligence. Depends on the sophistication level of the adversary. I would imagine that you could, with relative simplicity, tell the difference between an open source, one that was built based on open source software versus one that was built for higher end military and law enforcement use. And I would imagine that that would also be then differentiable from the legitimate cell tower networks.
Okay. All right, Dr. Meyer, back to you. In your testimony, you state that to your knowledge, other than the recent DHS pilot project, no component of the U.S. government has acknowledged a capability to detect cell site simulators in the field, including wireless carriers. Additionally, in a response to Senator Wyden, DHS specifically claimed it did not currently possess the technical capability to detect cell site simulators. Should DHS have this capability, and if so, how difficult would it be for them to actually have it?
So there are commercial tools available for law enforcement and regulatory agencies to attempt to detect these devices. The inherent challenge with detecting these devices is that there is no definitive telltale sign of a cell site simulator. There are only indicia that give rise to suspicion that the tower appears to be configured in an unusual way. And it appears to be broadcasting on unusual spectrum or unusual power level. But there are many reasons why legitimate cell towers are configured in unusual ways, either intentionally or unintentionally, or where they may appear and disappear, such as getting set up for a special event. And so, again, while there are commercial tools available, I'm not aware of anyone who's used any of these tools to definitively identify one of these devices, and that's why my recommendation is focusing on defense rather than whack-a-mole with the folks setting these things up.
Dr. Clancy, in its mobile device security study, DHS concluded that it believes, and I'll put that in quote, that all U.S. carriers are vulnerable, end of quote, to the SS7 and the diameter attacks, in addition to the federal government having little assurance that it's paying for cellular service and mobile devices that incorporate cybersecurity best practices. Since DHS has responsibilities for the protection of critical infrastructure of the government, in your opinion, should DHS continue researching the risks through pilot programs and studies like the 2017 pilot? What DHS S&T would be the appropriate division to continue this research?
So within DHS S&T, there would be two logical groups. There's a public safety group and there's a cybersecurity group. Perhaps it would be an interesting collaboration between the two that could focus on these topics. I do think that there's room for continued research on developing and maturing these tools. I do also agree that the sort of whack-a-mole approach would be challenging. Anytime you identify what you think is a unique signature for one of these devices, a sophisticated adversary could change that signature in order to avoid detection. I'll also note that there are apps that are available that purport to identify a rogue base station. And there was a systematic study done last August, it was published last August, which showed that they were able to fool all of those apps into thinking that their rogue base station was indeed a legitimate one. So again, supporting this notion that whack-a-mole would be challenging against a sophisticated adversary.
Mr. Byer.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Mayer, you wrote that in 2016, the major wireless carriers committed to targeting rollout for caller ID authentication in the first quarter of 2018. And as of today, not a single major wireless carrier has adopted rigorous caller ID authentication. Can you tell us why? Is it ridiculously expensive? Has they been otherwise distracted? AT&T, for example?
Ranking Member Byer, before answering that in just a moment, if I might add to Dr. Clancy's response on the last question, that our allies across the pond in the United Kingdom actually have their government audit communications carriers to make sure that these SS7 and diameter vulnerabilities have been addressed. The notion of DHS jumping into the carriers maybe is not may be worth further discussion, but at any rate, our allies have a different approach to this than we do. With respect to the robocall issue and call authentication, my understanding is that the carriers are not eager to make new investments in what they view as a declining area of their business. The growth in cellular communications has been in data and not in voice. And so investing new money in voice security is a bit of a tough proposition when these are systems that are just not going to be revenue generators in the future.
Despite the fact that there are billions of robocalls made that harass Americans every year.
That's right, and I think an extra dimension of this that I will certainly say I find personally frustrating is the major wireless carriers not only have not taken steps to address the issue, but in fact charge a monthly fee if you would like to use their services to address robocalls.
Yeah. Wow. Thank you very much. Dr. Clancy, you write that criminal organizations could theoretically take advantage of the technology, but they haven't. Why not?
Well, it depends on in order to take advantage of the technology, you need a fairly sophisticated sort of intelligence analysis function. If you're simply catching IMSIs, you have to know to whom those IMSIs belong. And that isn't readily available if you're just doing this opportunistically. So law enforcement and foreign intelligence are spending a lot more time on the analytic component in order to develop those relationships and know what IMSI they're looking for. Whereas criminal organizations often don't have the analytic capacity to accomplish that. So they've been focused on more brute force technologies like just jamming the cellular signals in order to accomplish their ends.
Okay.
At least that's been my observation.
All right, good. Thank you. Dr. Romine, I think it was Dr. Mayer who wrote that other than the DHS pilot, no component of the United States government has acknowledged the capability to detect cell site simulators in the field, nor wireless carrier has acknowledged such a capability, and the Department of Justice has not initiated any prosecution for operating a cell site simulator. Is this a hole in our federal capabilities, and where does Nist fit into this?
Let me address, thank you for the question. Let me address the second part of that first, which is that NIST's role in this space, I think, is to strengthen the security of telecommunications networks. And we do that principally through our engagement with the standards development process and in the guidelines that we publish, such as the special publication I referenced in my testimony, to try to provide useful input for operators and others who might like to strengthen their telecommunications activities. The question of the gap, or if there is a gap in this, is probably a little above my pay grade. I don't know what the right answer to that is. I would say that certainly the Department of Homeland Security has a role to play as the sector-specific agency for the telecommunications sector. Beyond that, it's not clear to me.
Well, thank you, Dr. Mayer. You wrote that paragraph. Well, what was your intent in talking about this gap?
My view is that while it is worth spending time on attempting to improve detection of these devices, the far better or far more effective focus for federal policy would be on defense. We know how to defend against the worst of these attacks, and I think it would be a very reasonable thing for Congress to say, when we're spending all this taxpayer money on wireless services and devices, we expect at minimum defenses against the worst of the worst.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Mr. McNerney.
Well, again, I thank the chair for another round of questions. Dr. Romine, in your testimony, you noted that 4G systems have a number of operational capabilities that mobile network operators may choose to implement, and that's presumably to secure cell phone communications. Has Nist conducted an analysis to determine what has been implemented to date, how widespread that implementation is, and what's still needed?
Thank you, sir. We have not done that analysis. We don't do operational activities. We're not a provider of these services, and we don't have any insight into the way the operators are currently using these and whether the optional security features or privacy features are being turned on or not. From our perspective, I agree with the other two witnesses here that there's some low-hanging fruit here. The easiest part of this, I think, or the most important, would perhaps be addressing this idea of dropping back to 2G communications. And I want to be clear here: the vendors or the mobile operators are not doing this because of any lack of understanding of the concern of security. They're doing it to provide the best user experience, right? So the vulnerability exists because the telecommunications providers are trying to ensure a seamless communication. That said, I think it's going to take a collaboration among users, vendors, and the industry to ultimately complete the phase out of 2G communications.
That's what it's going to take, phasing out the 2G communications.
That's certainly one major focus that I think would make a difference.
Thank you. Dr. Clancy, you said that in the past, both industry and the federal government need to significantly increase cybersecurity funding research. You said that the government often approaches cybersecurity with a, quote, after-the-fact solutions applied with duct tape and bubble gum. You also said that cybersecurity investments by both the federal government and industry are drastically underfunded. Do you have any specific recommendations on funding levels or investments in federal cybersecurity R&D, or comments on what the federal government can do better to address our cybersecurity research efforts?
So as an academic, it's always I think I'm congressionally required to lobby for more university research funding.
Yeah.
But no, seriously, I think that there is a critical need for continued investment in cybersecurity. The World Economic Forum states that cyber risk is the #1 risk to international organizations doing business in the United States. Right. This is the challenge of our time and needs to be the focus of significant R&D investment, particularly in the cellular spaces, where the majority of the R&D investment is happening in the EU. The Horizon 2020 program out of the EU is funding almost all of the 5G security research right now, and we have very little being funded here in the United States, either through the National Science Foundation or DHS. And that seems like a key opportunity for the U.S. to take a leadership role in an area as important as this.
Well, it's our responsibility to decide how much money to spend on these things, and we need guidance. So if there's a place we can go to find that kind of guidance, I think it'd be very useful.
Okay.
Dr. Clancy, you have said the United States needs for 1 million cybersecurity-related jobs, but that an estimated 31% of those jobs are vacant now. You also pointed to the fact that American universities are not offering the right kind of courses to train people in cybersecurity. Do you have any recommendations for Congress to try and help energize efforts for the right sorts of computer security expertise that our nation needs?
So yes, there are
Similar question.
there are currently 300 100,000 empty cyber jobs across the country. Here in the DC region, we have 42,000 unfilled cyber jobs. We have the densest cyber workforce in the world here in the DC region, and among the highest vacancy rate because the talent is so sought after. So there's a range of different activities that are needed to invest in workforce development programs. The number of new cyber jobs that are needed each year exceeds the number of students graduating with a degree in computer science each year. So this needs to be not just viewed as a computer science domain. This is a domain for business and policy. A wide range of skills are needed in order to effectively combat this challenge. So, for example, there are federal programs such as the Cyber Corps Scholarship for Service Program that's administered by OPM and the National Science Foundation. I think opportunities to expand that program to focus beyond the pure technical skills of computer science would be an opportunity to densify the workforce pipeline.
And would you think that there's a significant opportunity for women and underserved minorities in this field?
Certainly. So cybersecurity is notorious for its poor performance in diversity, both in terms of gender and racial background. So I think programs specifically targeted women and underrepresented minorities in order to increase awareness are critical. And most studies have found that this isn't something you can start at college. This has to go all the way back to 3rd and 4th grade, where people are sort of beginning to decide whether or not a STEM career is what they want to pursue or not.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
All right, good stuff. Thank the witnesses for their testimony, very valuable. Members for their great questions. The record will remain open for 2 weeks for additional comments and written questions from members. This hearing is adjourned.